I was lying in a hospital bed with a concussion and a broken arm and 7 stitches above my eyebrow, and my 4-week-old daughter was down the hall in the care of a nurse who wasn't allowed to leave her station. And I had exactly 1 phone call left in me before the pain medication pulled me under. So I used it to call my parents and beg them to come take my baby. And my father said no. He said they were in the middle of my sister's engagement party, that they couldn't just drop everything and drive 2 hours because I'd got myself into another mess, and that maybe this was what happened when a person made the choices I'd made. And then, while I was still trying to form the word please, he hung up. I lay in that bed in the dark with my arm in a cast and my face stitched shut, and I listened to my own baby crying somewhere down a hallway I couldn't walk down, and I understood, in a way I never had before, that my daughter and I were completely alone in the world. I was wrong about that. I just didn't know it yet. Because 3 hours later, at almost 2 in the morning, the door to my hospital room opened, and the person who walked through it was not my mother, and it was not my father, and what that person did over the next year would change everything, for me, for my daughter, and for the 2 people who had refused us on the worst night of my life. Welcome back, and if this is your first time here, I'm asking you to stay all the way to the end, because what my grandfather said to my parents at my sister's wedding, 8 months after that night, is something the whole family is still talking about. My name is Claire Carver. I'm 29 years old, I'm a single mother, and for most of my life my family treated me as the daughter who'd embarrassed them, the cautionary tale, the one whose phone calls could go to voicemail because nothing she needed was ever really an emergency. This is the story of the night they were finally, completely wrong about that. If you've ever called the people who were supposed to love you on the worst night of your life and listened to them say no, leave a comment and let me know you're out there, and make sure you're subscribed, because sometimes the family that shows up isn't the family you called. To understand that phone call, you have to understand that I had spent my entire life being the disappointment in a family that valued appearances above almost everything else, and that I had finally, 2 years before that accident, committed the disappointment my parents could never forgive. My younger sister Whitney was the golden child, the one who did everything right in the order my parents approved of, and I was the older one, the one who was always slightly out of step, too loud, too sensitive, too quick to follow my heart instead of the plan. The difference was there from the beginning, in 100 small moments that added up to a life. I remember being 12 and Whitney being 9, and we both made my mother a birthday card, and mine was elaborate. I'd worked on it for days, a whole painted scene, and Whitney's was 3 crayon lines and a misspelled word. And my mother put Whitney's on the refrigerator and praised it for a week, and mine, she said, was, "A little much, Claire, you always have to make everything so dramatic." That was the phrase that followed me through childhood. Too much. Too dramatic. Everything I felt too loudly for my family's comfort, and everything Whitney did was just right, because Whitney had learned early to want exactly what my parents wanted her to want. By the time I was a teenager, I understood the arrangement completely. Whitney was the daughter they were proud of, and I was the daughter they managed, and no painted card, no good grade, no achievement of any kind was ever going to move me from one category to the other, because the categories had nothing to do with what I did, and everything to do with who they'd decided I was. I spent my whole childhood running toward a finish line that kept moving, and if you grew up that way, you already know the particular exhaustion of it. And then, at 26, I fell in love with a man my parents didn't approve of, and I got pregnant, and the man left, the way some men do the moment a thing gets real, and I made the decision that defined everything that came after. I decided to keep my baby. I decided to become a single mother, with no money and no husband, and a family that looked at me like I'd set fire to the family name. My father, Doug Carver, was a man who cared more about what the neighbors thought than about almost anything else, and an unmarried pregnant daughter was, to him, a humiliation he could not forgive. My mother, Sandra, followed my father's lead in all things, and so when I told them I was pregnant and keeping the baby, the temperature in my family dropped to something close to freezing and stayed there. They didn't disown me, not formally. They just made it clear in 1,000 small ways that I had moved myself to the margins, that I was now the family's embarrassment, that I would be tolerated but not celebrated, and that whatever happened to me from here on out was the consequence of my own poor choices. My mother did not come to a single doctor's appointment. Neither of them was there when my daughter was born. I gave birth alone, with a nurse holding my hand because there was no one else, and I named my daughter Rosie, after my great-grandmother, and I held her in that hospital room and I made her a promise, which was that she would never, ever doubt that she was wanted the way I had doubted it my whole life. And I want you to know that I kept that promise in the 4 weeks before the accident and in every week since. I was not a helpless girl waiting to be rescued. I had built a life, a small one but mine. I worked doubles at the diner and saved every spare dollar. I'd found an apartment I could afford and made it warm. I'd researched car seats for a week before I bought the safest one I could, the one that would later save my daughter's life. I read every book on newborns the library had. I was tired in the way only a new single mother is tired, the bone-deep kind, but I was doing it, and I was doing it well. And the thing my parents could never see, blinded as they were by their own shame, was that I had become exactly the kind of person they always claimed I'd never be, which was responsible, devoted, capable. I didn't need them to validate that. I knew what I was. So when I called them from that hospital bed, I want to be clear, I was not a screw-up begging to be bilaid out. I was a competent, exhausted, injured young mother asking for the one thing she truly couldn't do alone, which was be in 2 places at once while she was in surgery. That's all I was asking, and they said no. But there was one person in my family who had never once made me feel like an embarrassment, and he is the reason this story has the ending it has. My grandfather, my father's father, was a man named Hank Carver, and Grandpa Hank was, in every way that mattered, the opposite of his son. Hank had built a successful business from nothing over 50 years, a chain of building supply stores across the region, and he had grown genuinely substantial in the process. But he had never once let the money change what he valued, which was loyalty and decency, and showing up. Grandpa Hank had lost my grandmother 8 years before, and he had a quiet, fierce tenderness in him that the rest of the family had somehow failed to inherit. He had always loved me best, though he'd never have said so out loud, and I knew why. He said I reminded him of my grandmother, that I had her stubborn heart, that I felt things all the way down the way she had. When the whole family turned cold over my pregnancy, Grandpa Hank drove 2 hours to my apartment, sat down at my little kitchen table, took my hand and said, "You're having a baby." That's not a scandal, Claire. That's a blessing, and anybody in this family who treats it otherwise is going to answer to me. He was the only one. When Rosie was born, he was the first person to visit, and he held her like she was made of glass and light, and he cried, this 80-year-old man, and he said, "Hello, little Rosie. Your great-grandmother would have loved you so much." He was the family I should have had. I just didn't yet understand how completely he was about to prove it. The truth is, Grandpa Hank had been my refuge my whole life, long before Rosie. When I was a girl, and the house felt coldest, when I was the too-much daughter being managed instead of loved, it was my grandfather's house I escaped to. He'd let me help him in his workshop, and he'd take me fishing and not say much. And once, when I was about 10 and crying because my parents had forgotten my school play while making a whole production of Whitney's recital, my grandfather knelt down and said something I never forgot. He said, "Claire, your folks have a hard time seeing what's right in front of them. That's their loss, and it's a real one, but don't you dare let it make you think the problem is you. The problem has never been you." I held onto that sentence for 20 years like a stone in my pocket, the only adult voice in my childhood that ever told me I wasn't the problem. So when the door of that hospital room opened at 2 in the morning, and it was him, some part of me was not even surprised. Of course it was him. It had always been him. He was simply doing, one more time, the thing he had done my whole life, which was to be the one person in my family who could see what was right in front of him. Now I have to take you to the night of the accident, and I want to be careful telling it, because it was the worst night of my life, and also, strangely, the night my real life began. Rosie was 4 weeks old. It was a Friday in October, and my sister Whitney's engagement party was that evening, a big catered affair at my parents' house, the kind of event my family lived for, and I had not been invited, which tells you everything about where I stood. I was driving home from the late shift at the diner where I worked, with Rosie asleep in her rear-facing car seat in the back, the way I always brought her because I couldn't afford childcare, and the diner let me keep her in the back office on a blanket during slow hours. And on the way home, at an intersection 2 miles from my apartment, a man ran a red light and hit the driver's side of my car. I need to tell you the most important thing first, because I know how a story like this can sit in your chest. Rosie was completely unharmed. Not a scratch. Her car seat, the one good expensive thing I had scrimped and saved to buy because I would not cut corners on her safety, did exactly what it was built to do, and she slept through most of it and cried only from the noise. My daughter was perfectly, miraculously fine. I was not. The other car hit my side, and I took the worst of it, a concussion, a broken arm, a deep cut above my eye, and the paramedics had to cut me out and take us both to the hospital, me on a stretcher and Rosie screaming but unhurt, in the arms of a kind EMT who kept telling me over and over that the baby was okay. The baby was okay. I remember pieces of it the way you remember a nightmare, in fragments that don't connect. I remember the sound, which is a sound I hope you never have to hear, and then the silence after it, and then, cutting through the silence, the one sound in the world that mattered, which was Rosie crying, because a crying baby is a breathing baby, a living baby, and I remember sobbing with relief at the sound of my own daughter's screams. I remember a young EMT, a man who could not have been more than 25, reaching into the back and unbuckling her car seat with hands that were so careful, so gentle, and holding her against his chest and leaning down to me through the wreckage and saying, "She's perfect, ma'am, not a mark on her, you hear me. You did everything right. She's perfect." And I remember thinking, through the pain and the fear, that this stranger, this young man I would never see again, was being kinder to me and my daughter in that moment than my own family had been in 2 years. I didn't know yet how true that thought would turn out to be. I only knew that I was hurt, and my baby was alive, and I needed my family, and I was about to find out exactly what my family was made of. At the hospital, they took me back for scans and stitches and to set my arm, and they could not let a 4-week-old infant into those areas, so a nurse stayed with Rosie at the nurse's station. And that nurse, as kind as she was, could not stay past her shift, and could not legally take my baby home, and there was no one. There was no husband. There was no partner. There was, in the entire world, no one to take my newborn daughter except my family, who lived 2 hours away, and so from a hospital bed, dizzy with concussion and pain, I called them. I called my mother first, and she didn't pick up because she was hosting a party. So I called my father, and my father picked up, and I could hear the party behind him, the music and the laughter, and I told him, crying, that I'd been in a car accident, that I was hurt, that Rosie was okay, but I needed someone to come take her because I was about to go into surgery on my arm, and there was no one. And my father was quiet for a moment, and then he said the words I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. He said, "Claire, we are in the middle of your sister's engagement party. We have 40 guests here. We are not going to ruin Whitney's night to drive 2 hours because you crashed your car. You're an adult. You made your own bed with this baby. You can figure it out." And I said, "Dad, please, there's no one else. Please just come get the baby." And he said, "Figure it out, Claire," and he hung up. I want you to understand what that was. That was not a misunderstanding. That was not a man who didn't grasp the situation. I had told him I'd been in a car accident, that I was injured, that his infant granddaughter was sitting at a hospital nurse's station with no family, and he chose his other daughter's party. He chose the 40 guests. He chose the appearance of a perfect family celebration over the reality of his hurt daughter and his abandoned grandchild. And he made that choice in cold blood, and then he went back to the party. I lay in that bed, and I called my mother 3 more times, and she did not answer. And I understood that they were not coming, that no one was coming, that I was going to go into surgery, and my 4-week-old daughter was going to be handed over to a hospital social worker, because her own grandparents would not leave a party. If you have ever been refused by the people who were supposed to catch you, at the exact moment you had nothing left, stay with me, because what happened next is the reason I believe, even now, that the world is not only made of people like my father. What I did not know, lying in that bed in despair, was that one person at that engagement party had been paying attention. My grandfather, Hank, was at the party, because of course he was, the patriarch of the family, and he had noticed my father step out to take a call, and he had noticed my father come back with a strange, tight look on his face, and he had noticed my mother ignoring her phone. And being Hank, being a man who showed up, he had asked. He cornered my father in the kitchen and asked who'd called, and my father, perhaps not thinking it through, perhaps assuming his own father would share his sense of priorities, told him. He told him I'd been in an accident, that I was fine, probably, that I'd wanted them to come deal with the baby, and that he'd told me to handle it myself because it was Whitney's night. And my grandfather, 80 years old, set down his drink and looked at his son and said, "You did what?" And my father started to explain about the guests and the party and Claire's choices, and my grandfather did not let him finish. He simply turned around, walked out of that party without a word to anyone, got into his car, and started driving. It was almost 2 a.m. when the door to my hospital room opened. I had been moved to a room after they set my arm, and I was lying there in the dark, drugged and broken and certain I had never been more alone. And the door opened, and I braced myself, expecting a social worker, expecting the worst. And my grandfather walked in. 80 years old in the rumpled clothes he'd worn to the party, having driven 2 hours through the night, and in his arms, wrapped in a hospital blanket, fast asleep, was Rosie. He had stopped at the nurse's station first. He had found my daughter, and he had picked her up, and he carried her into my room, and when I saw him, when I saw my grandfather standing there holding my baby, I started to cry in a way I had never cried in my life, because it was the first time since the accident that I had felt like someone was going to take care of me. And my grandfather came to the side of my bed, and he looked down at me with my stitched face and my broken arm, and his own eyes were wet, and he said very quietly, "I'm here now, Claire. I've got her and I've got you, and you are not alone. Do you hear me? You are not alone anymore." And he sat down in the chair by my bed with Rosie sleeping in his arms, and he stayed there the whole rest of the night, and he did not leave. That night changed the shape of my entire life, and it changed it because of what my grandfather did next, which was not to make a speech or threaten anyone, but simply to take over, the way a person who actually loves you takes over when you cannot stand. He stayed at the hospital for the 2 days I was there. He learned how to change Rosie's diapers, fumbling and determined, an 80-year-old man relearning a skill from 60 years before. He brought me real food. He talked to the doctors. And when they discharged me, with my arm in a cast and a list of instructions I had no way to follow alone with a newborn, my grandfather did not take me back to my empty apartment. He took me home with him. He installed me and Rosie in the guest rooms of his big, quiet house, the house he'd shared with my grandmother, and he hired a daytime nurse to help me while my arm healed. And he simply, without ceremony, became our family. For 6 weeks I recovered in my grandfather's house, and for 6 weeks I watched an 80-year-old man fall completely in love with a baby his own son had refused to drive across the state for. And I began, slowly, to heal in more ways than the physical. There was one night in those 6 weeks I'll carry with me forever. I woke at 3 a.m. to feed Rosie, my arm still in its cast, struggling, and I came downstairs to warm a bottle and found my grandfather already in the kitchen, in his robe, because he'd heard her stir on the baby monitor he'd insisted on putting in his own room. He took the bottle from me, because my cast made it hard, and he sat in the old rocking chair that had been my grandmother's, and he fed my daughter in the dark kitchen at 3 a.m. This man who had built an empire and buried a wife and raised a son who would refuse a baby for a party. And he hummed to her, some old song I didn't recognize, and I stood in the doorway and watched, and he didn't know I was watching. And after a while he said softly, to Rosie, not to me, "Your great-grandmother used to sit right here. She'd have walked through fire for you, little one. And since she can't, I'll do it for her." And I had to put my good hand over my mouth so he wouldn't hear me cry. Because I had spent my whole life believing I was too much, too dramatic, not worth showing up for, and here was a man getting up at 3 a.m, at 80 years old, to feed my baby and hum to her in the dark, and asking for absolutely nothing in return. That is what love looks like. I was 29 years old and I was learning it for the first time in my grandmother's rocking chair at 3 a.m. And in those 6 weeks, my parents did not call. I want you to sit with that. After the accident, after the refusal, knowing I was injured, they did not call to check on me or on Rosie, not once. My sister Whitney did not call. The family closed ranks around the story that I had, as always, made a drama out of nothing, that I was fine, that Grandpa was overreacting, that this was just Claire being Claire. They had no idea, none of them, what was happening in my grandfather's quiet house, which was that the patriarch of the family, the man whose business had built the comfortable lives they all enjoyed, the man whose estate they had all, whether they admitted it or not, been quietly counting on, was watching his great-granddaughter learn to smile, and was thinking very hard about what loyalty actually means, and about which of his descendants had it and which did not. If you've ever watched someone show you, through their actions, exactly what love is supposed to look like, after a lifetime of being shown the opposite, stay with me, because my grandfather was not a man who let an injustice stand, and the reckoning was coming. Here is the thing about my grandfather that my father had fatally underestimated. Hank Carver had spent 50 years building something, and he was a man who understood, deep in his bones, the difference between people who build and protect and show up, and people who only take. He had watched his son become a man who cared more about a party than about his own injured daughter, and something in my grandfather, some last illusion about who his son was, had died in that kitchen at the engagement party. He did not rage about it. That was not his way. He simply made a decision, quietly, the way he'd made every important decision in his life, and he called his attorney, and he began to change some things. I did not ask him to. I want to be very clear about that, because I know how it looks. I never once asked my grandfather for money, or for an inheritance, or to punish my parents. I was just grateful to be safe. But my grandfather had decided, watching Rosie sleep in his arms, that the family he was going to leave his life's work to was going to be the family that had shown up, and not the family that had refused a baby for a party. The months between the accident and the wedding were, against all odds, the best of my life until then. Once my arm healed, I did not slide back into my old life of scarcity and exhaustion. With my grandfather's quiet help, the kind he insisted on and would not let me refuse, I found a small house near his, and I cut back to part-time at the diner and went back to the community college classes I'd abandoned when I got pregnant. And I built, for the first time, a life with a floor under it. And every Sunday I brought Rosie to my grandfather's house, and the three of us would have dinner, and he would tell her stories about her great-grandmother, and I watched my daughter grow up in the warmth of a love I'd never had as a child, and I thought, this is what I'm giving her that no one gave me. I did not, in all those months, call my parents. People ask me about that. Why didn't I reach out, try to fix it, be the bigger person? And the answer is that I had finally learned the difference between being the bigger person and being the person who keeps offering herself to people who have shown her exactly how little they'll catch her. I wish them no harm. I simply stopped auditioning for a love that had a permanent vacancy sign lit in the window. I had a grandfather who got up at 3 a.m. I did not need to keep knocking on a door that had been slammed in my face while I was bleeding. The reckoning came at my sister Whitney's wedding, 8 months later. By then my arm had healed, and Rosie was a fat, laughing 9-month-old, and I had moved into a small house near my grandfather's that he had insisted on helping me buy, and my life had become something I never could have imagined that night in the hospital, which was stable and safe and full of love. The wedding was a huge affair, the social event my family had been building toward for 2 years, 200 guests, the whole extended family, and I was invited this time, because not inviting me with Grandpa watching had become impossible. My parents greeted me with a stiff, performative warmth, the kind you put on for an audience, and acted, the way my family always acted, as though the accident had never happened, as though my father had never said the words "make your own bed," as though we were all just one big happy family gathered to celebrate Whitney. And I played along, because I had my daughter on my hip and my grandfather at my side, and I had learned that the person who has actually been loved does not need to start fights at weddings. But my grandfather, it turned out, had something to say. During the reception, between the dinner and the dancing, there were toasts, and after the best man and the maid of honor, my grandfather stood up and asked for the microphone, and the room quieted because when Hank Carver stood up, people listened. And my grandfather, 81 years old now, looked out over that room of 200 people, the whole family, my parents beaming at the head table, and he did not give the toast anyone expected. He started gently. He congratulated Whitney and her new husband and wished them well. And then he said, "I want to tell you all a story about family because that's what a wedding is supposed to be about." And the room settled in, expecting something warm. 8 months ago, my grandfather said, my granddaughter Claire was in a car accident. Some of you may not even have heard because it wasn't talked about much. His voice was steady and clear, and it carried to every corner of that silent room. She was badly hurt. Broken arm, concussion, stitches in her face. And her baby daughter, my great-granddaughter Rosie, 4 weeks old at the time, was at the hospital with no one to care for her because Claire was about to go into surgery. So Claire did what any of us would do. She called her parents and asked them to come take the baby. The room had gone very still. My parents' smiles had frozen on their faces. And her parents, my grandfather continued, looking directly at my father, told her no. They were at a party. They told their injured daughter to figure it out, and they hung up the phone, and they left a 4-week-old baby and a hurt young woman alone in a hospital 2 hours away because they didn't want to leave a party. You could have heard a pin drop in that room of 200 people. My father had gone white. My mother had her hand over her mouth, and my grandfather was not finished. "I left that party that night," he said, "and I drove to that hospital, and I picked up that baby, and I want to tell all of you what I learned, sitting in that hospital room at 2 in the morning with a child whose own grandparents wouldn't come for her. I learned the difference between the people in a family who show up and the people who don't. And I've lived 81 years, and I've decided I'm too old to keep pretending that difference doesn't matter." He set down his glass. "I've spent 50 years building something, and I've spent the last 8 months deciding who I want to leave it to. And I have decided that everything I have is going to the people in this family who understand that you don't refuse a baby for a party. Claire and Rosie will be taken care of completely for the rest of their lives. And the rest of you," he said, his eyes moving to my father, "are going to have to ask yourselves every day whether a party was worth what it cost you." And then my grandfather raised his glass and said, "To family, the real kind, the kind that shows up." And he sat down, and he took my hand, and the room erupted into the most uncomfortable silence 200 people have ever shared. And then, slowly, the silence began to break, and it did not break in my father's favor. I watched it happen the way I'd watched 100 rooms turn against me over the years, except this time it was turning the other way. An old friend of my grandfather's at the next table caught my eye and gave me a small, solemn nod. My aunt, my father's sister, who had spent 2 years treating me like a cautionary tale, would not look at her own brother. A cousin near the back said something to the person beside her, and the words made their way around, the way the truth always travels through a room, once it's been spoken plainly by someone everyone respects. 200 people had come to that wedding believing they knew the Carver family, the respectable Carvers with their successful patriarch and their golden younger daughter, and their slightly embarrassing older one. And in the space of a 3-minute toast, that whole story had been turned inside out, and everyone in the room now understood which daughter had been worth showing up for all along, and which parents had failed a test that an 81-year-old man had passed without hesitation at 2 in the morning. My father sat at the head table with his frozen smile, a man who had just learned, in front of everyone whose opinion he'd spent his life cultivating, that his obsession with appearances had cost him the one thing appearances can never buy. I did not gloat. I need you to know that because after everything, a person might have. But I sat there holding my grandfather's hand with my daughter asleep against my chest, and I felt no triumph, only a deep and quiet vindication, the feeling of finally, after 29 years, having someone stand up in front of the whole world and say that I had mattered all along. My father did not look at me. My mother was crying, though whether for herself or for what she'd done I could not tell. Whitney's wedding went on, because weddings do. But everyone in that room now knew the truth my family had worked so hard to bury, that on the worst night of my life, my parents had refused my newborn daughter for a party, and that the patriarch of the family had judged them for it and found them wanting. My grandfather leaned over to me in the middle of all that ringing silence, and he squeezed my hand, and he said quietly, just for me, "I should have stood up for you like that 30 years sooner, Claire. I'm sorry it took this, but I'm standing now." And I told him he had stood up for me my whole life in 100 quiet ways, and that this was just the first time the rest of them had to hear it. He smiled, and we sat there together, an old man and a young woman and a sleeping baby, the only 3 people at that wedding who actually understood what a family was. You cannot unrefuse a baby. That was the lesson my grandfather taught 200 people that night. Some choices, once made, follow you forever. The fallout came in pieces, the way these things do. My father tried, in the weeks after, to repair things with my grandfather, but Hank was not a man who changed his mind once he'd seen something clearly, and the relationship between them never recovered, because some betrayals cannot be apologized away, especially the betrayal of refusing a child. My sister Whitney, to her small credit, called me a few weeks after the wedding, and for the first time in our lives had an honest conversation with me, and admitted that she'd known I wasn't invited to her engagement party and hadn't fought it, and that she was ashamed, and we have built, slowly, something more honest than we ever had before, 2 sisters finally talking to each other like the truth was allowed. My grandfather changed his will, as he'd promised, and made me and Rosie his primary heirs, but I want to be clear that the money was never the point, and it still isn't. The point was the man himself. The point was that at 2 a.m, when I had nothing, the door opened and it was him. Grandpa Hank is 83 now, and he is still here, and he and Rosie are the great love story of my life to watch. She calls him Pop. She runs to the door when she hears his car. He keeps a drawer of her crayon drawings in his desk, the elaborate ones, the dramatic ones, the too much ones, and he tells her they belong in a museum. And I have to leave the room sometimes because I am watching my daughter receive, freely and joyfully, every single thing I spent my childhood being denied, and it heals something in me every time. I used to grieve the family I didn't get. I don't anymore. Because I look at my grandfather teaching my daughter to fish off the same dock he taught me, telling her she's not too much, she's exactly enough, and I understand that the love skipped a generation and landed, finally, where it always belonged. We didn't lose a family that night at the hospital. We found the real one, and my mother. I told you both my parents refused me that night, and they did, and for a long time I did not think my mother would ever find her way back to me, because she had stood beside my father's no and said nothing. But about 3 months after the wedding, my mother came to my little house, alone, without my father, and she stood on my porch and she could barely speak. She didn't make excuses. She told me that the sound of me crying on the phone that night, begging, had played in her head every single day since, that she had let my father speak for both of them because it was easier than the truth, and that she would never forgive herself for it. And then she asked me, in a small, broken voice, if she could hold her granddaughter. Rosie was almost a year old by then, a baby my mother had refused at 4 weeks and never once held. And I looked at my mother, and I made a decision that I know some of you in the comments will disagree with, and I brought Rosie to the door, and I put my daughter into my mother's arms. And my mother held the baby she had refused, and she wept, and Rosie, who did not know any of it, who only knew that a person was holding her, reached up and grabbed my mother's finger and held on. And I understood, watching them, that there is a kind of apology that cannot be spoken, that can only be made by finally, at last, taking into your arms the thing you once turned away. My mother could not undo that night, but she could pick up the baby. And she did, and she has held Rosie nearly every week since, slowly, carefully becoming the grandmother she should have been from the start. My father never did. Some people can pick up the baby, and some people can't, and that difference in the end is the whole story. So that's what happened. A father who refused his injured daughter and his newborn granddaughter for the sake of a party, and a grandfather who drove through the night, walked into a hospital room at 2 a.m. with that baby in his arms, and spent the rest of his life proving that the family that shows up is the only family that counts. They refused my newborn during the worst night of my life. And hours later, the door opened, and the man who walked in taught me, and eventually taught all of them, what love is actually made of, which is not blood, and not appearances, and not the right choices in the right order, but the simple, unglamorous willingness to get in the car at midnight and come. If you have ever called the people who were supposed to love you and heard them say no, if you have ever been refused at the moment you had nothing left, then I want you to hear what my grandfather taught me in that hospital room. The family you were born into is not always the family that will catch you, and that is a grief, but it is not the end of the story, because somewhere in your life there may be a person who understands that love is a verb, that it means showing up, that it means getting in the car. Hold on to that person. Be that person, if you can, for someone who has no one. And know that the people who refuse a baby for a party are revealing exactly who they are, and that you do not owe them your forgiveness or your presence, only the truth,